Okay, hi everyone. Like Paige, I'm a research social scientist with the Pacific Northwest Research Station. I work in a team, the Urban Wildland Interactions team, which is based in Seattle. We have a lab in Seattle. And for the most part, my work focuses on human interactions with the landscape at multiple scales. And most recently, I've been working on projects that look at kind of the landscape scale, the big regional scale. How do we understand how people interact with these places across boundaries, across borders? And I'll talk about that a little bit in the second half of my talk. I did a project on the Olympic Peninsula where we looked at the whole peninsula. So kind of taking an all-lands approach. But right now my goal is to talk to you about, well, three things maybe. Just a little bit about what public engagement is. Bruce set us up nicely for that, and so I won't dwell on that too much. He's the guru there. But then also to talk around and play around with this notion of the invisible middle. Like Cheryl, I've been hearing this term a lot. People saying, well, we have to go after the invisible middle. We've got to get that invisible middle to come to our meetings and to participate. And I started thinking about it, and, who is the invisible middle? What is the invisible middle? What does it look like? And how do we interact with various parts of the invisible middle? And I'll argue that there is no one middle. There are many publics, there are many middles, and maybe we use a different approach to reach different types of people. And then I'll talk about, if I have time, I'm going to try to go fast. Cheryl says it's okay, we've got time. I'll talk about the project I did in the Olympic Peninsula, which incorporates a new strategy using what Bruce talked about earlier, using maps and having people talk about maps and talk about the relationship to places through maps as a public engagement strategy. And if we have any time or during breaks, we can talk about it. A new project we're working on with the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forests that is a mapping-oriented public engagement strategy around the sustainable roads issue, which is, I think, pressing for everyone right now. So I know that's a big task here, but I'll try to go quickly through some of this. So let's start by talking about public engagement. I won't dwell on this too much, but we have in this wonderful paper up here, the 8 facets of successful public involvement. And more recently, Leach has published a synthesis of all the public engagement and public involvement literature. That's been up through 2006, I guess, when that was published. That was in the Journal of Forestry, and Bruce's work appears in there as one part of it. But so there's a lot of work out there about what successful public engagement is. And I will also say what successful public engagement is also depends on what your goals are. And we'll get into that in a few minutes. But, public engagement, I think the big message is frequently and often and throughout the entire stage of the process, involving people at multiple stages of the process, involving not just the adjacent communities, but all the communities in the region, in the area who may be indirectly and directly affected by what's going on in the forest, inviting multiple publics, diverse stakeholders, having the public engagement process be well-funded, well-facilitated, and well-supported by Forest Service staff, incorporating science, data, and information. That's a plug for research. I can't not say that, being a scientist. And that is something that's monitored objectively throughout the process. So why do we engage? Well, the agency has many different goals and many different reasons for engaging. And there's a lot of words up here. But my point is to say that there are many different reasons for going out to engage with the public, and they may not be all the same every single time you go. You might want to go to inform the public about a proposed action that will be taking place, to learn about the effects of those actions, to promote people's ownership and buy-in and participation in the decisions, to get residents to share knowledge, their local knowledge and their experiences, to collaborate, to deliberate, debate, discuss, complain many times, to build support for decisions now and in the future. Maybe you're getting together to brainstorm, get new ideas, and create creative solutions to problems that you're facing. And it's also good for promoting community relations, for perpetuating an ethic of participation and community engagement. And maybe you're engaging to identify new partners or new volunteers or new cooperators. So this is just a whole smorgasbord of why you might engage. But every time you go out there, there may be different reasons. Now, the project we're working on now at the Mount Baker-Snoqualmie National Forest is kind of interesting because it's about sustainable roads. And here's a situation where The forest is not able to keep as many roads open as they did in the past, and the road system is going to have to be constrained. It will shrink, and it might be 50%, maybe 80%. We don't know exactly how much it's going to have to be cut back. So in this case, the public engagement process involves the agency coming out, informing people what the challenge is, and a big goal of this engagement process is commiseration, getting people to feel sorry for the agency. We're in this horrible situation. We need you to appreciate that and cry with us and pull out your hair and help us because we're stuck. And so that's a really important goal of that particular public engagement process. And to get information, gather input, to help with the planning process, and to create an opportunity to deliberate and think. So these are all important goals of that particular project. The other goals that I have listed up here might be secondary, but identifying those goals is key. But you also have to keep in mind that the public has different goals, different reasons why they want to engage. Some are there to learn, become informed about particular issues. Some are there to be more aware of proposed actions and get involved in a particular action that affects them. Some people, and you know many people like this, they're there to be seen and heard. And they may not have a particular interest in this, but they always come to meetings and they always seem to have something to say. And the saying is the most important thing for them. Some people are vocalizing concerns about projects and their impacts. They want to have a role in shaping the final outcome. Some are there to represent constituents or represent tribal members or represent others. And others are there to help. They're there to pull up their sleeves and work side by side. So trying to figure out why people come to a particular session is important. And that your goals and their goals may not always be the same. And so providing a space and opportunity for some of these things to happen might be important. Or it might be important, if your goals are different, to limit the audience or limit the space for certain kinds of conversations to take place. So that's just a bit of background to get us thinking about public engagement. Now, there's this whole mystique of the invisible middle. What is the invisible middle? We have this sense that when we have a public meeting, there are two extremes who come to the meeting, the people who are for us and people who are against us, the people who are in favor of the project and the people who are opposed to the project, and that represents the bulk of the people who are commenting or coming to meetings. But that we're missing this invisible middle. There's a sense that there's this huge middle that's neither for nor against, but somewhere floating around and we're not getting to them. So that's what I want to talk about and sort of pick that apart for a second. Let's talk about who shows up at public meetings. And I invented some names here, but you may have seen some of these types of people come. I won't dwell on this for too long, but just think about a public meeting. Who's there? You have the professional advocates, people who are paid because they work for an NGO, they work for an organization, they work for an industry, and they're paid to show up and be there and represent that group and advocate. They're there to advocate, basically. You're probably not going to change their mind. Then we have what I call the passionate activists, people who aren't paid, but they are following this issue. They may be a member of a user group, a volunteer organization. They're a mountain biker. They're the head of the local mountain biking chapter, and they're following this closely. And again, they're probably there to advocate a position. They're probably not going to change their mind, but you never know. Then there are leaders, people who represent others, people who represent constituents, tribal members, residents of their community. They're there not necessarily to advocate for a particular position, but to protect and defend those they're there to represent and be wary and be on guard for things that might negatively impact that group that they're representing. Then you have the marginalized group, people seeking a forum to express their frustration, their distrust of government, their anger. They've been pushed aside, they've been left behind, and they're mad about it. They don't really necessarily have a big stake in this issue, or they might perceive that they do, but they're there because they're frustrated. And then you have people I call watchers. You get a lot of those at meetings, people who come from other agencies, state agencies, county agencies, interagency groups. They're kind of watching, monitoring, staying informed, being aware, and then maybe bringing that knowledge and information back to their agency. You also have the civic participants. These are the chronic meeting junkies, the people who show up to every meeting. They're just involved, they're engaged. They want to be part of the process. They may or may not have a strong stake in this issue, but they actually might be part of what we might call the middle. I'm calling this group the visible middle because they come to the meetings. And then we have, well, socialites might not be the best word. It was the best word I could come up with. Some people, and you know who they are, they come to meetings because there's not really a movie theater in town. There's not a lot going on. Their friends are coming, and they're coming to socialize. They may be roughly interested, but they're kind of there enjoying the whole process of being in the meeting, and they actually might be a group that you could persuade or you could inform or get on board with you. And then you have the accidental people, and I see this almost every meeting I've been involved in. Uncle Joe or your cousin or your spouse or someone who gets dragged along. And there they are in the meeting. They don't know what they're doing there, but they're there, and actually they're part of your audience too. And that's a potential person to get on board with your program. Sometimes people just show up at the wrong meeting. I've had this happen once in a while. They thought this is a garden club meeting, and here they are, and they got the garden club meeting wrong. But, well, they'll stay, and figure it out. And you don't know what's going to happen with that group, but there's always one. What are the common feature of most of these participants, maybe not the accidental ones? Well, they have a stake. We talked about stakeholders earlier. They have a stake in the issue. They have a passion or interest, and that's why they're there. Maybe it's a passion or interest in the issue, or maybe it's a passion or interest in that particular place where something is happening. They have awareness. They had access to information that this meeting was happening, and that's what got them there. So they're in some sort of a network, referring to what Paige was talking about. They're in some sort of a network that allows them to have access to this information that this meeting actually was happening. They have a sense of fluency. They're comfortable with the idea of going to a meeting, sharing their ideas or listening, being in a meeting, being around other people, understanding the language being spoken, and understanding the language of participation in a democratic process. And I call that fluency. And the people who come have a voice. They feel empowered. They have a desire to be represented, to be heard, to participate. And so that sense of empowerment is really key. They're available. They have free time that day. And they had access. They had transportation to the meeting. So that's a lot of factors. And if you're missing one or two of these factors, you're not going to be at that meeting. Now, I think about myself sometimes. I'm very passionate about the park in my neighborhood. There have been 10 meetings about that park. I have not gone to a single one. I have the interest, I have the awareness, I knew about the meeting, but I do not have availability, free time in the day, because I'm chasing soccer kids and running around and I'm working all the time. I just can't make it out. So maybe I'm part of the invisible middle. I don't know. Let's think about it. Now we're going to unpack the invisible middle. It sounds like a late night infomercial for some sort of a weight loss thing. I don't know. I don't want to go there, but I wrote that and I thought, I don't know. Okay, who is this invisible middle? I do care. I care about this, but, well, I'm not really directly impacted. Maybe that's the NIMBY idea. I've kind of given up. I've given up on all these processes. I keep going to meetings, nothing happens. Well, I wasn't aware of that issue. I didn't have a ride to the meeting. I didn't know about the meeting. I don't feel comfortable speaking up about my concerns. I don't feel comfortable going to a setting where there are a lot of people in a room who I don't know. I don't have any free time. I'm fighting other battles. I don't speak English. So these are all just kind of a brainstorm of all the reasons why you might be missing people at your meeting. So then I started thinking, I'm a social scientist, so I always have to come up with these really complicated constructs to say something really simple. I was working on this and got really excited about it. But let me just share it with you. Dale thought it was great, so I'm going to go forward here. What I started looking at was, okay, let's look at this in terms of a continuum. You have people who have empowerment. They have a voice. They feel comfortable coming out and expressing their views. So that those folks are on the top half of this graph, plus voice up there. Then you have people who just don't have that experience, exposure, that comfort. We'll put that as on the bottom as minus voice. On the right hand, we have plus stake, people who are interested, passionate, and have a stake in this particular issue. And on the left side, the opposite, people who just don't have any are not directly impacted by this. They don't feel that they have a stake in it. So what are the groups and where do they fall on this continuum or on this matrix, I guess we can call it? Well, the activists in the upper right corner, they have a voice. They practiced this before, and they have a stake, and so they're at that meeting. That's not the invisible middle. That's the people who come, people you see all the time. They may be pro or maybe against, but they're there. Then let's go back to the bottom corner first. We have the disenfranchised. These are folks who have a stake in the issue. They really care about it, but they've lost their voice, they've lost their passion, they've lost their trust. They care, but they're not coming, or they never develop that. They don't have the habit of coming to meetings and speaking out. And then on the left side, we have people who don't have a stake in the issue, or they don't perceive to anyway. On the bottom left, people who don't have a stake and don't have a voice, we call those the disinterested. And then people who don't have a stake and who have a voice, maybe they do speak out on other issues, or they are educated and experienced with the democratic process and coming to public meetings, but they don't particularly have a stake in this. So those are kind of our 4 quadrants. And then we have some floaters in between. I'm calling one the latent engaged up on the top. Those are folks who may or may not become engaged. They have the experience, the capacity, the personal capacity and ability to become engaged, but they aren't right now on that particular issue. So maybe they could be. So that's something to think about as a person running a public meeting. Do I want those people to become engaged? Then we have what I'm calling the situational activist. People who jump in, jump out, they become active or not, depending on whether they perceive that they have a stake in the issue, whether it's important in their backyard. They're not necessarily always an activist. They may or may not, be at the meeting. And maybe that's a group to focus on. So let's just kind of walk through all these. I kind of talked about these just now. We've got the activist with a strong voice, organizational skills, knowledge, high interest. That's not the invisible middle. We've got the situational activist who has a moderate voice and sense of empowerment, that skills, that knowledge. They might become interested or engaged when others mobilize them or help them or bring them to the meeting or get them informed. They might be single issue focused, but they also might rely heavily on public lands. So maybe that's a group that we pay attention to. There's what I call the latent engaged. Again, a moderate sense of empowerment and voice. They have a lot of potential capacity or ability to get involved, but maybe they have barriers to the process. Maybe they can't make it due to lack of time, like in my case, as I told you, lack of transportation, funds, technology. They don't know the meeting's going on, but they have a desire to get involved. And maybe that's a group to focus on. How do we remove those barriers? And then these 3 groups, do we want to focus on these? Do we care about the disengaged, the disenfranchised, and the disinterested? Yes, well, we might care about those groups. We may want to emphasize a focus plan to target one or more of these groups to get them more involved in the process. Folks with a strong voice and strong skills, but maybe don't have the knowledge or the interest in this particular resource management issue, you may want to get them engaged for some part of the process. Folks who are disenfranchised, who don't know how to participate in the process that we've set up, that's filled with all sorts of jargon and language and meeting culture that they're not familiar with, but have a high interest in this problem, we may want to target that particular group and get them involved. People who are disinterested, who don't have a voice and have no interest or stake in this issue, that might be a group that is a less of a priority to get involved because there's a lot of work and a lot of effort to get that group involved in your project. So my point is that we need to look at this middle and discern all the different groups involved and kind of figure out what our strategy might be. I won't go through this in detail because I just talked through it, but I think you'll have access to the slides if you're interested and you want to look at it and think about your own resource management problem and your own public engagement process and think about which one of these groups do I want to make sure is at the table. The activists, they're going to come. You don't have to even, wink and they'll be there, But the other groups, you might need some special attention. They might need more communication. We might need to remove some barriers. We might need to come to them. Okay, so that's just kind of I'm going to shift gears now. So that was kind of thinking about the invisible middle and how we reach out to the invisible middle. And I want to just kind of leave you with that. And maybe when we get to the discussion sections later in the day, we can revisit some of those things. But I want to talk to you and spend a couple minutes explaining what we were doing out in the Olympic Peninsula. And then maybe if we have time, we can come back and figure out how we connect or didn't connect with the invisible middle in that particular project. About 4 or 5 years ago, the supervisor, Dale Hum, who's now retired, of the Olympic National Forest, approached us and said, I need a better understanding of how people at a large scale are interacting with the National Forest. Right around the same time, our Secretary Vilsack came up with the all lands management approach. And we began to think, okay, given the direction that the new planning rules are going to incorporate an all lands approach, and given this need to understand human interactions on multiple scales, How do we look at this on a regional scale? How do we bump it up to that, what you might call the landscape scale, and look across boundaries? Let's see what this is all about. So what we did was work together with a research team at Portland State University and a group called the Institute for Culture and Ecology, which is a research team based in Portland that's now blending with Portland State, and a colleague from Stanford. And we came up with this process that we call the human ecology mapping process. And it's a human ecology mapping process, in this case, for gathering baseline data from the Olympic Peninsula, but we're now applying this to a very similar process to the public engagement strategy I mentioned earlier that's taking place on the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest related to sustainable roads. What is the human ecology mapping process? What is the strategy I'm talking about? Well, first, the idea, and Bruce set this up earlier, the idea that you put a big map up on the wall, you put a big map on the middle of a table, and you lay out some questions, and you get people talking about what matters to them and what's important to them by looking at maps, drawing on maps, and talking through the maps. That's the basic idea behind this. And so what we're doing is gathering socio-spatial data. The advantage of the socio-spatial data is that we can look at it on maps visually, and I'll show you a few later. And we can integrate it with biophysical data through the GIS layers. So if we have information about where people are going, what they're doing, and what places they value, we can also overlay that with maps of endangered species. We can overlay that with topography. We can look at recreation infrastructure. We can look at other layers and see those things together. So what can be mapped? We can map places of social value, biological value. We can map hotspots where there's an intensity of resource use happening. We can map special places, which I'll talk about. We can map places that people think need management attention. There are problems here, and I'm going to show you where the problems are. We can map places where people want certain treatment preferences happening or occurring. Or we can map our desired forest outcomes and conditions. And there's a lot of ways that you can do this. I'm going to talk about a workshop approach that we used on the Olympic Peninsula. But you can also do this through traditional public information sessions. You can have a web portal where people provide information to a website that's mapped information. You can go to a county fair or to a market, a Saturday market, and set your maps up and have people come to you and draw on the maps. You can do mail surveys in a more traditional social science sense. There's a lot of different ways to gather this information and a lot of different ways you can collect it. The most standard way is through points, and you may have done this before, where you have dots of different colors and you're putting dots up on a map. That's called the point method. In our approach, I'll show you in a minute, we use points, lines, and polygons. We actually allow people to draw lines up and down rivers or trails and to draw big circles around places. This is just a map of the Olympic Peninsula. We worked and did community workshops in 8 communities and had 169 participants over the course of 2010 and 2011. We wished we could have done more, but we just didn't have the funding. This was a pilot project that our R&D unit supported wholly. We used a workshop approach because it was an important goal for Dale Hom, the supervisor of the forest, to have a more engaged session, openness, creating trust, and dialogue and communication between the community and the agency. So we didn't feel like a survey was going to achieve that goal or a web access. We wanted to get out there in the community. We had 2 main questions that we asked. These are 90-minute workshops. We had people gathered around tables, and you can see a couple photos of that. We had maps down on the table, and we had mylar or plastic over the maps. And we asked 2 questions in 2 separate exercises. The first question is to pick 5 places that are important to you on the whole Olympic Peninsula. And then they picked those places. They told us on a worksheet why those places were important, what activities they did there, and how often they went there. Then we took a break, and afterwards we had them think about their favorite or important outdoor activities that they did in the forest. What are those activities? And they listed them: hiking, photography, cutting firewood. And tell us up to 5 places where you go to do those activities. 5 places you go hiking, 5 places you pick mushrooms, 5 places you cut firewood, and identify those places. So the first activity was really about values. What do you value? And the second activity is about places that you go. And I'll give you more specific information about the values piece. Once we had them identify the place, we had a list of landscape values, 13 or 14 of them on this list, and we had them all defined, and we asked them to assign a value to that. So here's this place that I go. It's a ABC beach. I value this place because of its recreation opportunities. So they assigned a value to it. And then they told us in their own words why they valued that place. Then this is what an example of a worksheet would look like. I value Ruby Beach. My primary value is the aesthetic features there. The secondary value is recreation. This is an actual quote from someone. Well, it's a unique location to go along the highway, rocky beach, a view. What activities do you do there? Hiking, photography, picnic. So that's an example of how they did that activity. And then, again, they mapped the resource uses, the resource activities that were important to them. I'm just going to now show you a few quick examples of some of the outputs, some of the maps that we created. And then I think I'm probably going to run out of time.
You can go till 11:30.
Okay.
You're good.
Is it? I can't read military time. I've been staring at that clock all morning. I wanted to show you, this is just what the raw data looks like. It's really cool. I can't stop looking at these. And this is all 169 people and everything they mapped, all layered on top of each other. The circles, the dots, the lines. The first one is for the values, the second for the uses. And we could probably stare at this and come up with some interesting questions just looking at this. The first thing I'll show you is density. We looked at density, the number of points that people mapped in different places. And you can see the first one is the density of landscape values. You can see they're heavily loaded on the western end of the Olympic Peninsula near the rainforest, Quinault and the Hoh rainforest. The darker the color, the more dense the values were for that particular area. And this is all values, all different kinds of values. We're not discriminating by economic value versus recreation, not quite yet. This is just a density of values. You could consider these darker areas hotspots. And the one on the right is the density of resource uses. Now, I'm just going to point out one thing on these two maps. The values covered almost every square inch of the peninsula. So we had some people who mapped the whole peninsula and said they valued it because it's my home. We did actually take some of those out because it was kind of messing up the data. But you did have a lot of big people, well, they maybe have been big, I don't know, but a lot of people who made big circles and shapes around things when they talked about values. But when we actually asked them, well, where do you go? We got some of the same patterns, but look how it's much more narrow and more fine on that density of resource uses map. So that tells us something, and then we can dig into that. We can pull up a certain place and look at it, or we can discriminate by different kinds of values and uses, which I'm going to look at just briefly here. But before that, I want to show you one more thing. We can also look at diversity. How is that different from density? Diversity is a mathematical calculation where we look at the number of different values or the number of different activities that occur in particular places. So you could actually compare density and diversity. But I think this is important because in some of these darker spots, I note one on the left side and the values kind of near Lake Quinault, and there are several in terms of resource use, you could say that these are places that are valued for very different reasons by the highest number of people. So one particular spot might have people valuing it for aesthetic reasons, for economic reasons, for recreation purposes, for foraging, collecting, and gathering, all in that one spot. Well, as a land manager, you can then take a look at that spot and see where are these spots that this is all happening. And then you can ask questions and query that kind of information. Now I just want to do a couple of comparative things. I know that's a lot of maps, but so it's not important the detail on this, but what's important is just kind of the pattern. So kind of step back and look at the pattern. This slide shows how different communities or different regions, we kind of grouped them by region, 6 regions, mapped differently. So these are places that they visited. These are the landscape uses or activities. And so you can see people tend to, if you know where these places are, it's hard to see, people tend to value and use the places near their home. Well, that's not really surprising, but it really is interesting to actually see it displayed in a visual way. The Forks community, which is labeled there, I don't know if you can pick that up in the upper left-hand side, they valued the places near Forks. The North Central people who live up near Port Angeles, Washington, valued the areas near their home, but kind of shifting a little bit towards Forks. We have folks in the North Hood Canal, more spread out. which means they're traveling farther. And same with the South Hood Canal. Those are folks who tend to live closer to Seattle and maybe are traveling further to get to their favorite places. So my point is you can look at this information by subregion and look at some interesting trends. And then you can also look by different activity types. So in the upper left-hand corner, we have non-motorized recreation next to motorized recreation. So that's kind of interesting because the non-motorized recreation, if you know this landscape at all, is following the rivers up into the rainforest. And it's very linear in general. Whereas the motorized recreation, you've got these big circles. Well, that kind of makes sense because motorized users are traveling in circles and looking at networks of roads as opposed to maybe hiking up a river or something like that. Look at the economics in the lower left. Big areas, all focused on the west side of the peninsula, which is a very important area historically for timber harvest. And I don't have the slide here, but it almost matched up identically with the value called home, the economic. So that's telling a story about what's important to people. And then fishing, shell fishing, that again follows that kind of linear corridor path. This isn't rocket science, but it's interesting to be able to collect this information and then see it spatially. And here, just the last comparative one I'll show you is the diversity of landscape values. Economic, big areas, highly dense on the west side. And look at that big, on the upper right, that big circle near the Quinault area saying we value this because it's our home. Recreation and aesthetic. The one thing I wanted to mention that we've learned from this exercise is that people who live on the Olympic Peninsula, the areas that they value and talk about, if we look through, kind of make a circle around the middle. And does anybody know what's in the middle? The park. The park is in the middle. And I haven't done this analysis yet to see what proportion of the actual number of points mentioned were on the parklands, but it was rather low. We saw the donut. So people who live there are using the forest. Now, we did another study with a graduate student from PSU last summer. She went out and did this very same methodology, slightly adapted, and talked to visitors. So anybody guess what we saw? It was just so profound. Almost 100% of the points they mentioned were on the park. That's kind of interesting, again, looking at that all lands approach. Well, what does that mean? So I don't have that slide because she just told me that this week. Okay, so I mentioned before, one of the advantages of this method is that we now have data that we can actually use and integrate spatially with other data. So this is just an example of how you could do that. This is the upper sort of North Hood Canal area blown up. And then we imposed on top of that recreation access points, trailheads and campgrounds and things like that to see, well, how is that matching up? You know, there was no reason for doing that other than to show you that it can be done. And you can, again, kind of query this information in different ways using different GIS layers. We've also been adapting this more recently, and then I'll talk about a couple examples, and then I'll close up. But a couple years ago, we recognized, and this goes back to the invisible middle, we recognized that a big growing population on the Olympic Peninsula were Latino. It was a Latino community, and they were especially active in forest harvesting, mushrooms, and salal and other plants and ornamentals for commercial and personal use. And they weren't showing up at the meetings. And that's for some of the reasons we talked about earlier. Language barriers and feeling comfortable with the process, knowing about the meeting, awareness. And we wanted to make a special effort to reach out to this community, and we received a small grant to do so. It was very small, just $20,000, but we held a mapping session with 14 harvesters in Spanish. It was all done in Spanish. And we put maps down and we asked them questions about where they go and what they do in the places that they go and what their biggest concerns were. And the number one concern they mentioned was safety, feeling safe in the forest, not feeling safe in the forest more accurately. And so we then organized a subsequent meeting with various agencies, Forest Service, Park Service, state DNR, different county agencies to talk about safety. And we pulled these maps up and looked at the maps, and then they all gave presentations in Spanish that were translated into English to the law enforcement officers and agency representatives in the room. And this amazing dialogue ensued that went on for 2 hours of people talking and translating and coming up with very creative ideas for how to improve safety for the forest harvesters. And now they're implementing them. They've got vests out there that they're wearing. They have signs that they're making, letting people know that people are working in the forest. Watch out for people. The safety issues were about hunting, but also immigration. So in this case, in this example, the maps were used as a starting point for dialogue that led into other follow-ups. And then the other two pictures are the visitor mapping project I mentioned on the Olympic Peninsula, which was different. The project I mentioned first was workshop-based, where we had people in a room gather around a table. And this was more of an intercept approach, where you're going out to campgrounds and out to picnic grounds with giant boards and having people draw on the boards. It worked really well. We had 300 people participating in that. And that's the one I told you about, where the results showed that they all go to the park. So I'll share some of that next time I see you, and whenever that might be. But a couple lessons. We can skip over a couple of these, but one thing we learned is that people have very different styles of mapping. Some people were mapping in squares. I don't know why, but they're using squares. Other people, instead of mapping the places, they actually map the labels for the places, which may not be near the places. So we have to learn how to accommodate for some of those tendencies. We did see some examples of what we call strategic mapping, where people came to the meeting with a particular issue in mind. In this case, it was the proposal for a new wilderness area on the Olympic Peninsula. And they came because they were against it, and they wanted to map and show that they were against it. And so we had a lot of discussions as researchers for how we deal with this data. When you have 15 people show up at your meeting, all organized, they've talked ahead of time, and they've coordinated the places they're actually going to map. So it makes those places more dense. That's why we saw some of the darker areas, and you'll see in this picture here, around certain places, because they actually kind of organized themselves that way. Well, do we throw that out? No. We think about it, we understand where it's coming from, and we factor that into our thinking about this particular activity. And how you collect the information affects who participates. With our workshops, we got all the people who always come to meetings and workshops, the people who have free time, they're available, they know about the meeting, they're in the network, they show up. And we're not getting some of those invisible middle that we talked about at the beginning. But the face-to-face survey approach grabbed people as they were walking by. And we tried that at the trailheads and the campgrounds, and we got great response for that. So our next step is to explore the use of some of these techniques to get more at the invisible middle. And we're going to be doing a project with the Deschutes starting, I think, late this year. And we're going to set up at public markets and at the mall and at county fairs and set these kinds of booths up and have people come. And maybe we can get that group that we're missing. So this is an evolving strategy of public engagement. We're still not getting that invisible middle, but we need to think more strategically about how and which middle we go after and how we might get them. And so this is one example of something we might use. And I think that's about all I have. Yeah, that's about all I have. So.